Yes, yeah. And before we start, let me just do one thing here. Okay. So Snehal, can you help with the participant part, letting people in? Thank you. So we want to establish some common ground here. So um, as you may notice, this webinar is recorded. So now we're in this recorded Zoom meeting. And we would hope everyone make sure that you're muted so the noises, the background noises wouldn't bother others. And then the last thing is if you have any questions, feel free to put that on the chat box. We will be monitoring the questions throughout the entire talk and have the speakers to answer them. So we can start talking about why and how we come up with this webinar. I think when I think about this webinar, series webinar, I think about, we come up with this webinar from our clinical experience, working with a lot of Asian American clients and communities. And one area that we want to be more explicit is the process of owning our power, the process owning our strengths. And a lot of time we hear folks talk about, yes, I want to do that. I want to try and learn how to own my power, how to own my strengths, but I don't know how to. And how do I know something I don't know? We're not talking about this explicitly, and this is probably the primary goal of this webinar series, that we really hope everyone to be more explicit and specific about the process of how we own our power. And especially right now in the context of a lot of AAPI violence and hate crimes in the area, especially in the Bay Area here. And so I feel like this talk is so much needed. So that's the goal of this webinar series. And for today's topic is healing community, Asian American experience of mentoring and social support. I think one of the goals that we hope to hear more from our speakers today is really to address this mentoring and networking is a mutually beneficial process. I think about my time in the past, when I seek mentorship or when I network with others, I always have some sort of anxiety, whether it's my personal or my cultural anxiety associated with that. So I really want to hear more from Arpana and Kimberly today. All right, so I think it's a good time to introduce our speakers today. All right, so let's welcome Dr. Arpana Inman. Yay! Hello. Yeah, she's the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the College of Education and Human Ecology at the Ohio State University. And she is a nationally recognized scholar in the area of South Asian psychology, international issues in psychology, and multicultural supervision and training. And she has over 100 publications that has presented nationally, internationally in these areas. And she has held numerous leadership roles in several national organizations and is the past vice president of AAPA and past president of Division 17, the Society of Counseling Psychology of the American Psychological Association. Thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate you with us. And another speaker today, Kim Langrehr. She's associate professor in counseling psychology at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and currently serves as a director of training for the doctoral program there. Her research focuses on the context of socialization for postmodern families, implications of transnational adoption throughout the lifespan, and the consciousness transformation. Dr. Langrehr is also a practicing psychologist and co-founded the nonprofit organization, Korean Adoptees of Chicago. Beginning in the fall 2021, this year, She will be transitioning to a new role as a faculty in the psychology department at Roosevelt University in Chicago. I'm so happy for you, Kim.
So we realized that this webinar is a shorter webinar. We're going to be together as a group till 8:50. For those who feel comfortable, feel free to turn on your camera. I know this is a poor substitute to meeting in person, but I think it'll help our speakers as well to kind of see you as they share their experiences with us. Basically, Christine and I put together a few questions that we will be asking our invited speakers. And the last 10 minutes will be for questions from the audience. So as you're listening and maybe mulling over your own experiences or hearing from them, if you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat box, and Christine will be monitoring that. So we'll get started. I'm going to ask the same question to both our speakers. Maybe if we can start with Dr. Langrehr. I'm really curious. What does mentoring and support mean to you? If you could share a little bit about that.
Sure. So for me, and this may sound a little broad or general, but it's mentorship and support are social relationships, supportive relationships. I'm a very relational sort of person, and that's my style. And so for me, mentorship hasn't been as formal as one may think in terms of having like an assigned mentor, and instead has been much more based on sort of mutual respect, shared interests. And I think the most successful types of mentorship that I've received have been in relationships where I don't necessarily identify as a mentee or identify the person who's providing me with mentorship as a mentor. And instead I feel like they see me as something beyond just a mentee or a graduate student or advisee, that they see me as an individual and as a professional. And so for me, and that also includes peer mentorship, which can be, in my opinion, just as powerful and sometimes even more, accessible, especially when you're a graduate student and or a psychologist.
Yeah.
I love, you hit on so many powerful points there. This idea of maybe the most powerful relationships are the ones where you're seen as a person and not just as a mentee. And the ways in which we can build and connect and grow, not just with people who we might traditionally see as above us, but even those who are peers or maybe earlier in their careers. So thank you so much for that. Dr. Inman, I would love to hear more about what you think about what mentorship and social support means to you.
I don't think my answer is too different from Kimber's answer. It's about relationships and connections. It's about support and support in different ways, whether it's encouragement, advocacy, sponsorship, coaching, exposure, creating visibility. It's really kind of a way that the relationship can help build cultural and social capital for us in our relationships. So that kind of stands out for me when I think about mentorship.
I really appreciate that. And it sounds like there's a lot of parallels there. Dr. Inman, I might actually just go with you because we're speaking to you already. How have you cultivated mutually beneficial relationships and networks in your life? What has been helpful to you?
Yeah, I think it's similar to kind of what was said earlier. It's about having similar interests and some sense of kinship. It's an issue of trust that you have in a relationship, and authenticity, and humility. And this goes to kind of what was said by Kimber earlier, that there's a sense of peership or that you're a teacher and a learner at the same time, and the relationship can flip a little bit where it's more of a peer relationship where you're learning from each other. There's humility in that relationship, and it evolves very naturally. It's not something that you force on someone. um,
Mm,
I like what you said, Kimber, about the informal piece, because a lot of my mentoring relationships have kind of come through an informal process.
mm, mm,
Yes, I love that idea of that informality. Like, I
mm,
think that sense of letting it naturally grow. And I think that's something that is personally for me taken time,
mm,
because I grew up in a culture where there was hierarchy was helpful in maintaining society, right? And time
mhm,
was precious. I think when I looked at authority figures, time felt so precious. So then the idea of
mhm,
reaching out when it doesn't feel needed was something I myself had to sort of learn to kind of shift in this idea of
mhm,
growing in a more nuanced and beneficial way. So thank you so much for
mhm.
sharing that. Um, Dr. Langer, I would love to hear what your thoughts are in terms of how you've cultivated
Mhm.
mutually beneficial relationships and social networks in your life.
So I'm really starting as a graduate student and actually with AAPA in particular. I just got involved in sort of as much as I could as a volunteer. And I don't know if Nellie Tran is with us today, but we always like to share the story that we sat on the bus together for the very first AAPA back in 2006, and that's how we
Mm,
met. And this was before I was a PhD student. I was like shopping for doctoral programs, and so just a really great example of like we both became very involved. I think we both started to volunteer for the conference planning committee,
mm,
uh, and sort of look at as now, right? So I just
mhm,
rotated off the EC board, and now he's been vice president and served on multiple different roles, and so becoming involved and at any time, and I think that's the other piece is that professional service will always be there. It's not
mm,
going anywhere. So there's always going to be opportunities, I think, to get involved. And so for myself, that has been, especially with the APA, just the opportunity to connect with my peers, as well as more seasoned individuals and work with them, on conference planning committees or other sort of special interest groups have been, great learning experience. And then also just to be able to, again, develop sort of that, those relationships uh,
mm,
that have continued.
mm.
So I love how you brought up AAPA. I realize not everyone might know what AAPA is on this call. It's the Asian American Psych Association. It sort of feels so connected to what you said of finding those common interests and finding those organizations or networks or spaces that you're already leaning towards, and then finding the people who you resonate with. Sounds like that's been really important in your growth. So thank you so much for sharing that. Um, I'm really curious about this. The next question is a big question. The next question, and I'm going to stay with you, Dr. Langer, if you don't mind. How have family and cultural norms affected how you build relationships? This is a big dissertation.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm a bit of an outlier in that, I identify as a transnational adoptee, and so having been raised in a primarily white communities, but at the same time, Korean, Asian American, um, I've really found a mentor who holds like the exact same dimensions of my identity, and I don't think I maybe ever will. So I've been really used to sort of operating on the margins and taking sort of mentorship where I can get it in very sort of piecemeal fashion. And in some ways, I feel like this has worked well. I think for me, is it sort of allowed me to invest or engage in connections that are truly beneficial and don't necessarily it's allowed me to sort of avoid or bypass like a very painful way of belonging or being connected to someone. And so I think in some ways my experience of operating on the margins has helped and allowed me to sort of operate all over and take what I can get. But at the same time, I think there's always questions about legitimacy as a faculty member, as a researcher, as an Asian American too. And so the relationships or the mentorship relationships that I have engaged in and continue to engage in, I really feel that those individuals appreciate really the depth of my experience there.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that piece of, I think one of the things I loved about actually when we invited you was, I think it felt so relevant to how we ourselves within the Asian American community can sometimes police belonging. And I think at least for me, it felt really important. You're two of you. There's no way you're going to represent everyone. But I think it felt important to show the wide ways of existence and living that we have, but also like the commonalities that exist as well. So thank you so much. And I really appreciate that sense of finding that mentorship and connection in that deep way and seeing who can see you as that person and value all of that. Dr. Inman, I would love to ask the same question of you. How have cultural and familial norms shaped how you build relationships?
That's a good question, and I've been thinking a lot about that. What comes to mind is, as an South Asian Indian woman, first generation immigrant here. I grew up in a culture where I think, Snehal, you talked about kind of the hierarchy. And oftentimes what I learned was someone who's older is wiser, right? And so when I came to this country, that's what I was looking for. I was looking for someone who was older because I thought, well, that's the kind of person who's going to have greater wisdom. And very soon that bubble was broken. Because I met people younger than me, who were wiser beyond words, and became my mentors, and some of them are within AAPA that I met, and they really played a very significant role for me in socializing me and nurturing me and helping build connections. And so, it's kind of how sometimes we hold on to something that's very cultural, which may not necessarily work within another culture. And so, that was kind of a piece that I wanted to share. But the other piece is sense of community and identity, which has always been very important for me, and the notion of paying forward. And that's kind of what I see in terms of mentoring, that you're really paying forward with what you're gaining, and you're kind of, passing that on to someone else. And it really takes a village. And I think that's kind of what's happened in my life, is I have a whole village who's supported me to be where I am today. And I feel that, it's the intergenerational kind of community building from different spaces, different places, that has really supported me in a way that has also allowed me to share power. And that's quite contradictory in some ways to the Asian culture of the notion of sharing power, if you think of traditional cultures. So yeah.
I'm like, I love all the words coming out of both of your mouths. Truly. Like, I think this is so powerful, this idea of how we might ourselves bring our own stereotypes of what the world looks like. And then as we live in it, we often talk about how we experience the stereotypes, but we don't often talk about how we perpetuate it. And I love your example of how the world shows us that maybe there are other ways of being wise. And the sense of passing on that wisdom and building that coalition of power really resonated. So thank you so much. We have one more question for both of you. Dr. Inman, what do you wish your younger self knew about this topic?
That's another great question. When I first came to this country, I was looking for a relationship which would mimic me, that it would be with someone that looked like me. Came to this country about 35 years ago. And, you know, I felt it was important to have gender matching, racial matching. We read about all that in the literature. And there weren't as many South Asians around when I was studying and looking for people who looked like me. So just to kind of know that mentoring comes in different places and shapes and sizes and colors, and it's really about values, about shared values. It's about shared kinship and kind of the mentor's humility in wanting to do things in the service of the mentee. And that is something I learned, that I've had mentors who really kind of you know, invested in me for me, accepted me for who I was, who I am. So that was one of the things. And the other thing is also that mentoring relationships aren't free of conflict. You know, we kind of think about mentoring relationships in a way that kind of is, oh, it's all kind of wonderful and always great, but you know, part of this is kind of negotiating a relationship for both, right? It's a mutual relationship. You can't force a relationship of mentorship. So just to know that, you know, you can have disagreements and yet doesn't mean that the relationship is going to go away. But I think both the mentor and mentee grow, and it's more of how you grow in that relationship that's more important. The quality of the relationship and how you share power. I think sometimes that's challenging sometimes for people, where power, sometimes people have a hard time letting go of ego and privilege, and that can kind of hurt the mentoring relationship. And so really the need for humility, the need to know that you're a learner at times, and you learn from your mentee. And that's really important for a mentor to kind of realize. And it's really about relationship and trust and honesty.
Thank you so much. Oh, Christine, please.
I'm just feeling very touched. I think you're speaking to my younger self and then part of myself right now that really trust the strength of the relationship, especially the conflict part. It is about forming the relationship, and then we need to have that trust on the strengths, on the resilience of the relationship itself. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I love that sense of, we want trust and honesty, and those are the words we usually talk about. We never realize how conflict can actually help us grow, right? And if it's done with grace and humility, it can actually be so powerful for everyone involved. So, you know, as a psychologist, I'm like, yes, this is great. So, Dr. Langrehr, I'm curious, what do you wish your younger self knew about this topic?
So I myself am consider myself to be approaching on sort of mid-career right now. So kind of leaving early career status to mid-career. And so one thing that I would tell myself is that mentorship, your need for it doesn't end just when you graduate. And that it is just as important to continue to sort of seek that out and value those relationships as an early career, mid-career, seasoned professional. And, you know, I think in some ways, you know, I had this impression that once I graduate, I'm there, I've made it, right? I really don't need that degree of mentorship anymore. And, you know, as your time starts to become even more limited, right? You start to sort of value those relationships that you maybe had sort of built in as a graduate student, which I certainly, do. So that's certainly one thing, is that mentorship really continues, and the need for it continues. Also, that I think, what Arpana hit on, good, solid mentorship isn't, always seamless. And, it's not always, some very successful, I think, type of mentorship relationships that I've had have continued and have, took place over the course of, 15 years or so, and, starting at the beginning of my graduate career. But I can also point to some really great mentorship and mentors who I continue to think about and who have stayed with me, who I share a lot of their wisdom with the students that I work with, who I don't necessarily speak with anymore, but they had, we had a temporary relationship, like as a practicum supervisor, or, someone like that, who I'm certainly not, there was no reason we were not communicating, but it's not as sort of built in terms of keeping those relationships. And so mentorship, even though it may not follow you, certain relationships may not follow you throughout your entire career, you can still get really important mentorship along the way. And sometimes, at least for me, some of the most surprising, maybe not surprising, but the most critical types of wisdom that has stuck with me have been from individuals who I never would have thought or picked them out as mentors before, where we, we're sort of paired up, and, I think where I was, able to allow myself to listen and engage in a relationship and with someone that I didn't necessarily think, we had that much in common, but I was able to learn, so much. So I think, what Arpana said about the humility part is huge too, both as a mentor and as a mentee.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Langrehr. I really appreciated that sense of how some mentorship relationships go on, and some that might be temporary, but they have this lasting impact. And not only do they have this impact on you, but that wisdom is passed on, I'm hearing, through conversations with other people, whether it's peers or students or colleagues. There's this sort of living legacy to wisdom that, honestly, I'm actually seeing both of you embody right now as you are sharing with everyone here. We've never met all the people who've had an impact on you, but it feels palpable. So thank you both very much. So I know at this point, we were actually thinking about asking the audience about any questions you might want to ask our invited speakers. Christine, remind me, were we going to do the chat box for the questions?
Yes, and yeah, so far I don't see any questions yet. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'd really encourage people to ask, even share reactions as well that you might have, because I think, even when we were creating the space, I realized sometimes we get caught up with what's the right question to ask, right? Or what to do, what's the best way. And I think this is a beautiful opportunity to take, to just, whatever's on your mind, to just share it with the group.
Mm-hmm.
Can we speak, or do you want us to chat?
Oh yeah.
Chat.
I have one question, and then two, and then maybe we'll have your question too. I want to make sure yeah. Yes, yeah. Okay. So the first question I'm seeing is, what has been your experience like as an AAPI POC clinician in a predominantly white field? Very good question.
So I guess I can speak to that, and especially since I'm in the Midwest. I've been in the Midwest for all my graduate training and early career, and so predominantly white institutions are also what I am used to navigating, and so I haven't had a lot of people of color or Asian supervisors or um, uh, um, formal mentors in terms of accessibility. So that, I think has certainly been and can be stressful on sort of the day-to-day ways of navigating some of the stresses there. Um, and, kind of go back to AAPA in terms of I learned how I could really lean on and rely on sort of this national organization that had, other students or early career professionals who were perhaps in similar situations as myself, to be able to connect and share and be able to um, support one another, especially given that local Asian Am communities may not, be as predominant. So, and that's certainly been, the combination of like everything, listservs, Facebook, being part of professional organizations. So really being able to take, again, sort of like what I can get in the different areas. But then also, I'm very involved in the Korean international adoptee community as well. So that has been a big part of sort of my ongoing social support and self-care as well.
Mm.
I think for me, I kind of realized very early on, and I also heard this from a lot of people of color, that, I may not always find mentors within the place that I'm working in. And that, as I said before, you can find mentors in different spaces. And certainly as a student, I became a member of AAPA and found a sense of community, which is very important for me. But also at that time, I was also going to ACA, the American Counseling Association, and they had the Association for Multicultural Development. And so I connected with that group, which is where I met one of my closest South Asian friends. So, I think sometimes we need to kind of look outside of the space we're working in. And just kind of connect with people and go to places that you think you might be able to speak to someone who might share some of your values, but also knowing that just because someone looks like you and seems like you doesn't mean necessarily they will be a mentor either. So it's kind of both and in terms of the process.
Yeah. I really appreciate the answers. And I think the next one is very similar on that vein. Can you say more about the concept of shared power? As a person of color, I've only been mentored by white individuals, and I've never considered having any part of power.
I think it's very interesting when we think of shared power and what we think about when we think of power as well. And I think this session, this webinar started with the notion of power, right? Kind of looking at how we own our power. And so I think that's part of it in terms of kind of feeling comfortable in your own skin in some ways and being able to kind of be authentic to yourself. And sometimes you have to try it out with people. Again, mentoring is something that evolves. It's not, I've had formal mentoring and sometimes that hasn't worked. I've felt that informal mentoring has worked better just because I think the connections that happen organically. And in that space, sometimes, and I think when I think of power, it's about ego. How can people kind of let go and be in a space and relationship and share their mistakes or failures, and things like that. And that's kind of where you're kind of minimizing the power when you share things that make you vulnerable. So that's kind of what I think about when I think of power.
Hmm. Hmm. Kim, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think, and I can certainly empathize with having a lot of mentors who are white and having to navigate some of those tricky spaces, sometimes surrounding power. And I also see another comment here about mentors who may not have sort of those lived experiences, and and I have gained a lot more insight about mentorship once becoming a faculty member and starting to provide mentorship as well, and understanding too, and this is maybe more from a position of being a mentor or my experiences as a mentor, that when I do try to provide everything for students or try to be everything and cover everything, that usually doesn't work out very well either. And so being able to own my own sort of limitations and restrictions, and I think also getting to that ego point that Arpana pointed to, understanding that I can't be everything for everyone. It would certainly be nice, right? But there are certain experiences that just cannot be replicated, and hopefully with the mentors or the individuals in your life who you're sort of kind of navigating those things, um, you know, uh, you don't have to expect everything from just one individual. And hopefully they will um, have the willingness to sort of point you in the right direction, or at least, give you some resources to be able to connect with other individuals too. So to expect everything from one person is, a lot these days. And it's okay to branch out as much as you can.
Yeah. I noticed we have a lot of questions on the chat box, and I also want to make sure that Banu, you ask the questions that because you voiced out. So I want to make sure you ask your questions. Yeah.
Oh, I was sharing reactions more than questions. It was
Ah.
really, I think, nice to hear both of you speak, Dr. Langer and Dr. Inman. I think one thing that actually stood out very much for me is what you said, Dr. Inman, about mentorship comes in various forms and not just um, what people look like. It's very unformulated. But for me, I was realizing that, oh, I do not have South Asian mentors. I have to seek that more. Like, I think they'd understand an aspect of me being an international student more than other people. But sometimes I just realized that I might close certain experiences and not be open to it when I approach things that way. And it was very powerful just to listen to you say that, oh, it comes in all sizes and forms. And being open might open more doors to just seeing how values match with other people. And yeah, so I just had that reaction that I wanted to share.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. We have about 5 minutes, and I think we can cover this question. This is important too. Sometimes mentors may not know what kind of support to provide, especially mentors who may not have similar lived experience. How to ask for what you want. I think the younger me would probably want to hear this part too. How do I ask for what I want, what I need from my mentors? Yeah.
I think this kind of maybe addresses also the other question of what does mentorship look like. And I don't know if there's one type of mentorship or that. I think Kimberly, you touched a little bit upon this, that one mentor can't really provide everything, and also mentors are just people like all of us. I don't think sometimes we put people on pedestals.
Yeah.
I think that can create challenges in a mentoring relationship, because then again, it's not necessarily a shared relationship. Sometimes you're looking for someone who has that expertise, right? Which is a different kind of guidance that you're seeking, maybe because they're an expert in an area of research and you're looking to them for some guidance, and maybe you might call it mentorship. Maybe it's kind of helping create greater visibility for you when you go to conferences, for instance. That so I think it's kind of what it is that you're looking for, and different people give different things. That's why that's why we have restaurants.
Yes.
You got to try out a little bit here, try out a little bit there, and sometimes it clicks, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it's temporary, sometimes it's a longer relationship. So I don't know, and again, they may not have the lived experience, but if they share your values, and they are willing to enter that relationship with grace and humility, I think that says a lot. And also look for people your own age too, or someone younger. Again, you never know where you're going to find that kind of advocacy or sponsorship or support. So hope that answers your question.
I really appreciate you mentioned that de-idealization. I think a lot of time we look up to a particular group to offer that nutrient. In fact, like you said, there's so many restaurants. Yes. Yeah.
And I have an example just from my experiences as a early career professional, and getting involved. This is, I acknowledge, is different probably for a faculty member versus a student, but getting involved or trying to attend some events that the university has been holding, particularly surrounding diversity and inclusion, has certainly opened up opportunities for me to, again, get involved in certain things, activities, planning, and connect with particularly women of color who I would have never interacted with if I stayed in my little silo in the School of Education. And although I wasn't necessarily looking for a certain type of mentorship, I can say what has flourished from that has been amount of peer emotional support, particularly around issues of like racial stress, being in a predominantly white institution, and also then being able to share some of my experiences as an Asian American, and bringing some of those things to light has been a very, I think, empowering process, especially when I feel like my voice is being heard. But I don't think that would have happened, or the relationship would have evolved as successfully if it wasn't organically, if it organically sort of developed as it did, as opposed to being kind of assigned and having much more sort of contrived sort of relationship. And so it can take time, so I'll say that can take time and patience, and and you want to be able to meet the right people too, and vet them appropriately as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, I think we are approaching to the end. So, Snehal, do you want to say anything?
I want to thank everyone. Of course,
Yeah.
our invited speakers, thank you both for your time and your wisdom, but everyone who joined, I think in some ways for me, just seeing people come together in and of itself was pretty powerful. So I hope this was helpful to you.
Yeah, you just really appreciate you see the community with so many different faces, and then also see all the allies with us, and then just make me feel very warm in this space. Thank you all. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well,
Yay. Thank you, Dr. Inman. Thank you, Dr. Danger.
yes.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Take care,
You have a
everyone.
good rest of your evening or night or whatever time zone you're in.